Okay. All right, we'll take item 7A.
All right. So the next item on the agenda is an informational briefing on offshore wind development in California. As you have heard in previous briefings and will hear again today, discussions around planning for offshore wind development have been active for more than 5 years amongst a coalition of state and federal agencies, tribes, NGOs, developers, academics, fishermen, and local communities. We are now in the precipice of moving from the planning stage to the leasing and project development stage. However, before we can make this transition, both the state and federal government have important regulatory decisions to make to ensure that future offshore wind development is sited responsibly in locations that are both feasible and protective of coastal resources. The Coastal Commission plays an important role in this process, and the purpose of today's briefing is to educate commissioners and the public on how the regulatory review process for offshore wind will work in preparation for those upcoming regulatory decisions. Before we jump in, I would like to note that today's briefing is centered around offshore wind development in federal waters. There have been smaller scale proposals for wind installations in state waters. In fact, the State Lands Commission is currently conducting a preliminary review of 2 proposals for wind turbines in state waters off of Vandenberg. However, it is likely that the vast majority of medium to large scale offshore wind development will be proposed in federal waters, and thus that is the focus of our briefing today. Next slide, please. Here is a brief agenda for today's briefing. We will start with presentations by state and federal agencies. First up will be California Energy Commissioner Karen Douglas, who will provide a high-level overview of how offshore wind fits into California's energy and climate goals. She will be followed by Jean Thurston Keller, a renewable energy specialist and California Offshore Wind Task Force coordinator with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, who will describe the federal process for leasing and review of offshore wind projects. The last presentation will focus on the state's role in reviewing offshore wind development with a focus on the Commission's federal consistency review of potential lease areas, and will be provided by your energy, ocean resources, and federal consistency staff, including myself, Holly Wire, and Amanda Kuzart. Agency presentations will be followed by public comment, and after that, there'll be an opportunity for questions and comments from the commissioners. So now I'd like to turn it over to Commissioner Karen Douglas. And Billy, I believe Commissioner Douglas does not have a presentation or slides, so we can go back to the Hollywood Squares view. There we go. Commissioner Douglas.
All right. Thank you so much, Kate. And good morning, commissioners. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to speak to you on this really important topic for California. I'm the point person for California on the BOEM California Task Force, which has broad state and local and tribal participation from around the state, as well as federal agency participation. And I've been working with our interagency California team, as well as the BOEM of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management on offshore wind since 2016. And in that time, as Kate mentioned, we've made a lot of progress in understanding how offshore wind could play a role in California, the value of the resource, potential areas where it may be appropriate, and some of the data and information that we're going and outreach that still needs to be done in order to really be able to fully assess projects when they're brought before us. As Kate mentioned, we've now reached the point where our work on offshore wind is transitioning from the more exploratory and preliminary stage to a point where California is going to be making decisions about lease areas and ultimately projects in conjunction with our federal partners. And as Kate mentioned, and as subsequent presentations will describe in more detail, the Coastal Commission has a very critical role to play in this. So I'm going to leave the details on offshore wind process and next steps to others. My presentation is really focused on some of the broader context and how this relates to California's climate and energy goals. So
Recording in progress.
In climate policy, we have very aggressive goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors of our economy. That includes the electricity sector, where we are working to achieve a 60% renewables portfolio standard by 2030 and a 100% zero carbon goal by 2045. We're currently in the electricity sector meeting our targets. We're on a path to continue to achieve our targets, and our share of greenhouse gas reductions. But we're going to have to continue that, and we're going to have to continue that in light of ever more aggressive state goals and other parts of our economy, for example, transportation through electric vehicles, ports through electrification, some industrial users where possible, transitioning fuel switching to electricity. So we're going to be seeing demand increase for building uses from fuel switching, even as we are meeting more aggressive percentage reductions and moving towards zero carbon electricity system. To meet our long-term goals, we estimate that California could have to deploy renewable energy and storage at a rate of 4 to 6 gigawatts per year starting now and going on for decades. And so that just gives you a sense of context. I think the other context piece that I wanted to mention is that you may know that we are currently in an electricity emergency right now. There is an emergency proclamation that was issued by the governor for conditions this summer. And it's because we are experiencing a near-term climate-induced or climate-enhanced electricity emergency where we are operating a system that just wasn't designed around the level of heat events, west-wide heat events that reduce the availability of electricity imports, reduces the heat events, reduce output from gas plants. We're dealing with wildfires that also reduce through smoke the output of photovoltaic panels, transmission impacts. So the fires directly impact transmission. The smoke can impact transmission that can reduce imports into the state. Of course, the transmission lines have been found to have sparked major wildfires, and that has also had significant impacts into the electricity sector. In a normal year, we average 2 flex alerts per summer generally, and that's been the trend for quite a long time. This summer, including today, we are on our 8th, and we're not through the summer yet. So that's the other part of the context that I really wanted to bring to the Coastal Commission as part of this overall discussion. In terms of offshore wind, there are a number of reasons why it's a very appealing resource in light of our energy transition. It's got a very high capacity factor. That means that when you build a project, it's generating electricity much of the time, most of the time, in contrast with something like solar, which generates electricity when the sun is up and does not generate anything when the sun is down. Offshore wind has the potential to add significant resource diversity into our system. So the more dependent a system is on any one renewable resource, the more it has the risk of falling into a hole when something happens to impede that resource or when that resource is not available. So whether that's smoke reducing PV or the big issue we have right now is what we call our net peak hours. Those are the hours when the sun is going down. So the solar production is getting, less and less throughout the day, but demand is going up because people are going home and turning on their air conditioners and, plugging things in and turning things on. And so that net peak time, that evening time between 4 and 9 p.m. is very difficult for us in our system. And it just so happens that offshore wind is very productive during that net peak time. So it's a very good complement to solar. It's also very productive in the evening hours and really as I said, high capacity factor much of the day. So it adds geographic diversity. A lot of our renewable energy imports into load centers, which are coastal in California, Southern California, and the Bay Area in particular, come from east of those regions, and whether that's because they're all the way from Nevada or Utah, or whether it's because more likely they're from the desert or the Central Valley, they're coming from east and going to the coast. Bringing in some resource from the west actually helps us reduce the need to import additional electricity over very constrained lines, and it could help us actually reduce the need to have coastal gas plants. That's something we're analyzing, but to the extent that you can bring renewable energy into these load centers from the west, you then have energy that you can use to charge batteries and to help run the system, which in the long term, through some energy planning that our state energy agencies are working on collaboratively, I think we're going to see that as an important benefit. On the Central Coast, there's the potential for offshore wind to plug into existing infrastructure. There are also some interesting ideas for undersea transmission that could play into that. On the North Coast, that area is very transmission constrained. Right now, all projects that are being discussed are really for local consumption, but it's one of the best wind resources in the world. So there is long-term potential there. There are a number of energy analyses going on right now. Some look at the system and how it can work as we transition to our zero carbon trajectory. Some are looking at transmission. I'd be happy to share more information about them now and as they go forward. The CPUC is currently assessing offshore wind in the integrated resource planning process, the independent system operators looking at transmission. So in the energy side too, this is becoming much more of a here and now conversation, understanding that it takes time to bring these resources forward. But we're looking at them in a very concrete way. So I say all of that by way of context, but just stepping back for a moment to the Energy Commission's role and to our interagency state team. It's our goal to work together to bring the best possible information to the state broadly and to work together to articulate and promote the state's interests and policies here. So we're looking hard at environmental information. We believe very strongly in the need to conduct outreach and to engage Californians in what this could look like and how this could play out in coastal communities if these resources are brought forward. And to have that level of discussion, we supported that with a joint budget request, which was fulfilled. And so we do have some resources that we're working together collaboratively to bring forward. And I'll just close by saying that the Coastal Commission has a very critical role in this. And so our interagency team is very committed to supporting the Coastal Commission and the staff in bringing forward the information that you all will need and want to see. So I appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion, and I'm going to stay and listen as well, and I'll be available for any questions or discussion at the right time. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Next, we'll have Jean Thurston Keller present, and she does go back to our staff presentation. Her slides are incorporated with ours. Next slide. Next slide. Great, thanks, Billy. Jean?
Great. Well, good morning. BOEM would like to thank the Commission for the opportunity to speak before you today and to thank the Commission staff for their participation over the years in our planning process. We have worked closely with Commissioner Douglas and others on the task force to really identify areas that would be most suitable for offshore wind development. My name is Jean Thurston Keller, and I'm the BOEM California Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force Coordinator, and I'm the California Project Lead for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Pacific Regional Office. In addition to myself, Mr. Doug Boren and Ms. Lisa Galbane from our office will also be available afterwards today to answer any questions you may have. Next slide. Being mindful of the Commission's time, here are the key items we'll go over today. We'll start with a brief overview of offshore wind energy, as well as our joint collaborative planning efforts with the state of California, and look at some of the challenges of offshore wind energy planning. And then we'll focus on our process and where the Commission's work would interconnect with that, and potential areas we are initially looking at for future development. And then we'll have some next steps and sources for additional information for you. Next slide. So I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about the basics of the technology. Offshore wind farms are very similar in structure to land-based wind farms, but there are key differences, however. Offshore wind turbines are taller and larger than those found on land. Floating wind turbines also must be anchored to the seafloor with a mooring system and are electrically connected together with inter-array cables suspended in the water column to transport the energy to an offshore substation when required. This is required often for when amperage needs to be increased in order to send it to shore via export cables. These cables are often buried and meet land through horizontal directional drilling methods. Once on shore, the export cables would connect to an onshore substation and then deliver the electricity to the larger grid. Additional information about how an offshore wind farm works is available in a webinar link at the end of this presentation if you would like a more in-depth look. Next slide. So I really started with the technology because that's how we started our joint planning process. We began with the basics and started with technical constraints first to answer the question of where offshore wind could possibly go. So we began with the resource, looking at wind speeds that are greater than 7 meters per second based on recommendations from the National Renewable Energy Lab. Areas in gray on your screen are less than 7 meters per second, so not suitable. And then we looked at water depths. The experts at NREL again recommended roughly 1,100 meters for likely maximum depths. And so that's outlined in that dark blue line. And then we also avoided any national marine sanctuaries, which are shown in bright blue, where BOEM does not have leasing authority. This left us with about 6% of all of the waters offshore California could even technically support offshore wind development. This essentially bifurcates the state into two primary areas of focus for us: the north coast near Oregon and an area in the central coast between Cambria and Point Conception. We also considered where existing interconnection points to the grid were located. As Commissioner Douglas mentioned, Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant on the central coast is an obvious choice, along with the retired coal-fired power plant at Morro Bay. And on the north coast, there is an interconnection point at Eureka. So this is where we focused our efforts, closer to these interconnection points. Also, through conversations with the public and input from state agencies, we also did an initial screening to avoid areas closer to shore that tended to have higher concentrations of fishing activities. We also avoided areas with high concentration of submerged offshore cables and heavily used vessel traffic areas such as the Santa Barbara Channel. Next slide. This led us to really the challenging part of planning and siting potential offshore wind energy development. Through our outreach, we understand that there is not a single place offshore California that does not have some degree of use or conflict. So the key is balancing all these often conflicting uses and concerns. Next slide. So there's a lot of human uses of the ocean here in California. Next slide. Such as the fishing industry, the challenges of where the fishermen go. Next. There are also cargo vessels transiting offshore. Next. And the busiest port in the United States is located in Long Beach, California. There's also military operations. Next. Naval training activities. Next. And there are also non-human uses. Next, such as avian species who forage off of our coasts. Whales. Next. marine mammal species, next, and migratory paths and corridors for a multitude of species that utilize the rich resources of the California current. And further, there are unique concerns to California, such as landmarks of cultural significance, next, and views from the iconic California coastline, next, that we must consider in all of our decisions. Next. These are a lot of concerns, and BOEM has been mandated by law and by Congress to have the responsibility to tackle these issues and challenges as they apply to leasing in federal waters. But as mentioned before, we don't conduct this responsibility alone. There's several state and federal laws that would apply to any project that would be built and connected to the shoreline. So although BOEM is charged with the decision, it affects many other uses, other groups, agencies, and laws. And so we work with others to fulfill our responsibilities. Next slide, please. Because of these overlapping responsibilities, BOEM and the state of California established a task force in 2016 to look at offshore wind energy planning and the potential for development. The task force is a governmental forum that includes sovereign tribal nations, representatives of US federal government agencies, government of California, and locally elected representatives. Through early discussions in 2016 and 17, BOEM and the state developed a joint outreach plan and created a website to house data and information that we would collectively gather moving forward to inform our planning and siting process. In 2018, after many months of outreach, BOEM and the state identified 3 areas offshore California based on our initial screening and stakeholder outreach results. BOEM published these areas for official public comment in the Federal Register. We received over 100 comments and 14 nominations of interest from potential developers. BOEM and the state will continue to reach out to affected users and to local communities who may be affected by our decisions. This and more information is summarized in 2 editions of the California Offshore Wind Energy Planning Outreach Summary Report that's available at the link provided at the bottom of your screen. Next slide. So some of the key input that we heard, stakeholders identified several key issues, including fishing, environmental concerns, and potential visual and noise impacts from turbines. In response, we've begun more fishing-related studies and are working with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Pacific Fisheries Management Council to better understand fishing dynamics, including changes over time. Based in part on concerns expressed about navigational safety and shipping, the United States Coast Guard is conducting a Pacific port access route study to look at several emerging issues, not just because of offshore wind development, but there are several other issues. But they will be looking at vessel traffic and port access. So we are jointly working with them as it applies to offshore wind. Stakeholders expressed concerns about potential visual impacts, and BOEM worked with California State Parks and the Coastal Commission to develop visual simulations of what an imaginary offshore wind farm would look like from key points along the coast at different distances. Stakeholders also expressed interest in potential economic impacts and benefits and how BOEM would consider local community benefits in any future auction process. And so we'll be looking at that in the future. The Departments of Defense and Interior have been in long discussions about military testing and training activities offshore California and its potential compatibility with offshore wind development. So the key takeaway from this slide is we do listen and we do have an obligation to balance multiple and often conflicting needs and concerns. But there are no areas offshore that do not have some degree of conflict. Next slide, please. So here's a slide on the California Offshore Wind Energy Gateway. It's our data portal that we developed in conjunction with the California Energy Commission. It's here if you'd like more information on the different data sets we have. There are links to spatial data in addition to metadata, journal articles, and reports. As new data becomes available, we work with our partners to get these data into the gateway, and the website is available at the bottom of your screen. This data is very important and can feed into key environmental review points and decision points in BOEM's renewable energy authorization process. Next slide. So BOEM's process, it follows 4 basic phases starting at the top left: the planning and analysis phase, the leasing phase, the site assessment phase, and then finally construction and operations. We're currently in the first phase of the process in the planning and analysis phase, which began in 2016 with the establishment of the task force and public outreach and engagement efforts to identify potential areas for leasing. In 2018, BOEM identified those 3 areas offshore California for potential leasing, and we published these in the Federal Register in a notice known as the Call for Information and Nominations, which you can see with an arrow. It says BOEM initiates leasing process call. Following publication of the call, BOEM uses the comments received to identify the areas that appear to be the most suitable for future leasing through area identification. These areas that become known as wind energy areas would then be the focus of an in-depth environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. If, after NEPA review, areas for leasing are offered, we move to the next phase in our process, known as the leasing phase. The leasing phase consists of additional public notices, including both a proposed sale notice and a final sale notice. And this includes more opportunity for public comment. And this is where federal consistency, next slide, under the Coastal Zone Management Act would apply. We anticipate a lease auction will occur in fall of next year. A lease, however, does not allow for any construction to begin. A developer must conduct surveys before designing a project. So the third phase in the process is the site assessment phase, where developers have up to 5 years to conduct site characterization surveys to assess the lease areas in minute detail. These surveys would answer questions such as what is the tensile strength of the seabed in order to determine what types of anchoring systems the developer would use. What does the seabed look like? What are the locations of rocks or canyons that should be avoided? Surveys are also done to answer potential data gaps, such as where could there be uncharted shipwrecks or potential locations of deep water coral beds. A lessee needs to understand these detailed characteristics of the site first in order to answer questions of how to construct a project, the best size of the turbines to select, and places strong enough that could anchor a structure. So this phase would end when a developer submits a construction and operations plan to BOEM, which is the 4th phase of our process. A second NEPA environmental review would examine the results of any surveys and the proposed construction and operation plan designs of an actual specific project. Next slide. This is also where the second federal consistency review would take place before approval of any construction and operations plans. So we don't have specific parameters and designs for an actual project, like the height of the turbines, how many, and where they'd be anchored, until the review of a construction and operations plan the lessee would submit to BOEM for approval after the surveys are conducted. So again, there's 2 NEPA processes and 2 federal consistency reviews. First is for lease issuance and anticipated site characterization survey work, and then a second federal consistency review for the specific construction and operations plan designed based on the results of those surveys. Next slide. These are the 2 areas that BOEM is considering at this time for potential offshore wind development: the Humboldt wind energy area on the north coast and a central coast area that may include portions of the Morro Bay Call area originally published in 2018, with 2 additional areas known as the east and west extensions on the central coast. And I'll describe how we got to those extensions in just a moment. The key takeaway from this slide is that these areas will have separate environmental reviews. Next slide. So for the Central Coast, the Morro Bay and Diablo Canyon call areas seen here were published for public comment back in October of 2018. Next slide. There were challenges associated with these areas. Next slide. For the Department of Defense concerning national security, and through high-level discussions between the Departments of Defense, Department of Interior, and the state of California, additional areas for consideration were determined to be the focus for more discussions to see if a working group led by Congressman Carbajal could find compatibility between military activities and offshore wind energy. These discussions focused on the Morro Bay Call area only. It did not consider Diablo Canyon at this time. So we are not looking at Diablo Canyon now. Next slide. In alignment with the state's goals and support of the Biden administration's commitment to a target of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, the White House announced an agreement to advance areas for offshore wind on the north and central coasts in May of this year, which includes an area of approximately 399 square miles offshore Morro Bay that appears to be compatible with military testing and training activities. This 399 square mile area includes 2 small areas, next slide, that were not within the original Morro Bay call area and Federal Register notice. So these two areas are the subject of a new call for information nominations that is open for public comment until September 13th. Next slide. After public comments are considered, BOEM will undertake area identification for the Central Coast and may identify a wind energy area and begin an environmental review. Because the Humboldt call area did not have any national security issues, BOEM is currently in scoping for an environmental assessment for the Humboldt wind energy area, which has already been identified. After completion of environmental reviews, BOEM will publish a proposed sale notice for both the North Coast and the Central Coast under one single all of California proposed sale notice. This proposed sale notice typically has a 60-day public comment period and is the last opportunity for developers to indicate their interest for an area. All public comments would then be reviewed and considered, and then BOEM would publish a final sale notice and conduct a lease auction where one or more leases would be awarded. Again, a lease does not allow for any construction activities to occur. BOEM anticipates holding the auction in fall of 2022. Next slide. So throughout all this process, BOEM funds and supports research to inform all of our decisions. Our studies are often driven by the results of our outreach, and several studies in recent years have been a direct result of input we have heard during our engagement efforts over the past few years. BOEM is partnering with several state agencies right now, and we're leveraging study funds and collaborating on ideas for studies. BOEM has partnerships with several California institutions, such as the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, or MBARI, Cal Poly, Humboldt State, several of the UCs, as well as state universities. Next slide. Here's a list of additional sources of information I promised you at the beginning of the presentation. I highly recommend bullet number 3, which is selected BOEM funded research informing renewable energy offshore California for the commissioners. Next slide. And then here are some more links to different things that we have available, including the visual simulations I talked about briefly. Next slide. So here's my contact information, and our team is available here today and anytime to help answer any of your questions. And thank you once again to the commissioners for the opportunity to come before you today. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Jean, very much. Back to Dr. Huckabridge.
Yes, thanks to Commissioner Douglas and Ms. Thurston Keller for their remarks this morning. And just so the public and commissioners are aware, we will post these slides on our website so that if you would like to go back and look at some of the links that were provided and just go back, it's a lot of information, we'll make that available on our website. So for the next slide, please. For the last part of the presentation portion of the briefing, we'd like to focus on the state's role in reviewing offshore wind development in federal waters offshore of California. And as I mentioned earlier, again, the focus for today is on process. We won't be getting into the substance of coastal resource issues or impacts today. That will come later. Next slide, please. The staff presentation will cover 5 main topics. First, we'll cover a very brief overview of federal consistency. We will then move on to the Commission's role in planning and permitting for offshore wind, followed by discussion of the scope of the federal consistency review prior to leasing, a description of some of the state's outreach and engagement efforts, and finally, ongoing and future research and data collection efforts. Next slide, please. The Commission's federal consistency authority is derived from the Coastal Zone Management Act, which many of you are familiar with, but I know we have a few new commissioners, so I want to make sure we go over some of this now. Passed by Congress in 1972, the CZMA provides for management of the nation's coastal resources through a federal and state partnership. Similar to the LCP provisions in the Coastal Act, the CZMA encourages states to develop a coastal management program, and once certified, describes a process for state review of federal projects or federally permitted or funded projects for consistency with the certified CMP. California's CMP was certified in 1977. The Chapter 3 policies of the Coastal Act serve as the enforceable policies of California's CMP. These are the policies against which all applicable actions are reviewed for consistency, and why the substance of a federal consistency review is largely the same as a CDP review. Next slide, please. The review process described in the CZMA is called the Federal Consistency Review Process. These reviews can be separated into two types. First, they're consistency determinations that apply to federal projects. Second, consistency certifications that apply to private projects that require federal permits or are federally funded. The test for whether a particular project is subject to federal consistency review is whether that project would result in spillover effects into the coastal zone. In regular permitting matters, the Commission's jurisdiction is determined by whether or not the project is located within the coastal zone. But for federal consistency matters, it is the effect of the project and not the location that determines jurisdiction. Next slide, please. With that introduction, we can now move on to talking about offshore wind. So this slide depicts the Commission's jurisdiction over various components of an offshore wind project, or at least to the extent that my crude PowerPoint skills will allow. In the center of the slide are the main components of an offshore wind project and their general locations in the onshore and offshore environment. This includes turbines in federal waters, power cables traversing through federal and state waters that connect to onshore transmission infrastructure. The Commission has a different type of jurisdiction over each of these project components. In federal waters, the Commission has authority to review under federal consistency. In state waters, the Commission has direct permitting authority. For shoreline and onshore development within the coastal zone, the specific location of the development will dictate whether the Commission reviews proposed development through a CDP, a port master plan amendment, or potentially an appeal of a CDP issued by a local government with a certified LCP. As with any major development project, there will be overlapping approvals required by a variety of other state, federal, and local jurisdictions. However, it is important to note that the Commission is the only state agency with a regulatory role in reviewing the project components in federal waters. Next slide, please. So let's zero in on the review process for potential offshore wind development in federal waters. If you'll recall Ms. Thurston Keller's presentation, there are two opportunities for state review of activities related to offshore wind in federal waters. The first will be a consistency determination to review the lease areas and process proposed by BOEM, which will occur prior to a lease sale. BOEM will submit this CD based on environmental analysis, or EA. It will prepare under NEPA for activities anticipated during leasing. The second opportunity will be a consistency certification for the construction and operation of a specific project. For these CCs, each individual project operator will be the applicant for those CCs. In discussions with BOEM and other state agencies and anticipation of a potential lease sale as early as next year, again, as you heard Ms. Thurston Keller mention, the Commission could see a CD for the North Coast wind energy area as early as March of next year, followed by a CD for the Central Coast in June. These dates could change, but are the current goals for review of leasing activities. So before I turn it over to environmental scientist Holly Wire to describe the scope of the review intended to inform this first consistency determination, I would like to point out that although the scope of BOEM's NEPA review prior to leasing is relatively narrow and focuses mostly on review of activities that could occur during leasing, such as buoy deployment and survey activities, Coastal Commission staff, along with our sister state agencies, believe that a broader review of potential impacts associated with offshore wind development within leasing areas is needed to inform a decision on whether BOEM's proposed leasing areas are sited in a manner that is consistent with the resource protection policies of the Coastal Act. To that end, our state agency coalition has been working independently and with BOEM to gather necessary data and information needed to inform this Commission's federal consistency review, which Ms. Kuzart will discuss in more detail. And with that, I'll go to the next slide and turn it over to Ms. Wire.
Thank you, Dr. Huckelbridge. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. I'd like to start by spending a few minutes describing the scope of the federal consistency review for these proposed lease areas. Overall, this is a siting level review and analysis of impacts to coastal resources from offshore wind development in those proposed lease areas. The review is going to make an overall assessment of the consistency of offshore wind development, the Coastal Act policies, and generally it will be seeking to address how the proposed lease areas were determined, what impacts we can anticipate from offshore wind development in these lease areas, are these the right areas to develop offshore wind in California, and what we can do to avoid or minimize impacts. Throughout this presentation, I'll be talking about mitigating, minimizing, or avoiding impacts. And I want to be clear that at this stage, mitigation is really about identifying strategies to avoid impacts rather than the traditional type of mitigation you would see for development projects. Next slide, please. More specifically, the consistency determination will assess consistency with coastal act policies relating to marine resources and water quality, commercial and recreational fishing, tribal and cultural resources, scenic and visual resources, public access and recreation, coastal hazards, and air quality. And for each of these policy areas, the consistency determination will make an overall assessment of the existing resources, identify potential impacts to these resources from generic offshore wind development, identify ways to eliminate or minimize impacts, as well as possible mitigation strategies, assess consistency with the enforceable policies of the Coastal Act, and identify data gaps as well as expectations for information needed when we start doing project level analysis. I'm going to take a moment to go into more detail on a few of the Coastal Act policy areas, including marine resources and water quality, scenic and visual resources, tribal and cultural resources, and commercial and recreational fishing. Next slide, please. The marine resources and water quality analysis will include an analysis of impacts to benthic habitat and aquatic vegetation, including deep sea corals, which we've heard about through a number of presentations today, marine species, including pelagic and benthic fish, marine mammals, sea turtles, and birds. We'll also be looking at water quality, including potential impacts to upwelling. On a side note, offshore wind is considered a fill of coastal waters under the Coastal Act, and so the consistency determination will include an analysis of the proposed action and a discussion of alternatives. Next slide, please. For scenic and visual resources, views are really a critical component to public access and enjoyment of the coast. To conduct our scenic and visual impacts analysis, we will be identifying and focusing on visually sensitive areas within the viewshed of the proposed offshore wind lease areas. We'll be using visual simulations developed by BOEM to understand the visual effects of offshore wind, including both daytime and nighttime views. And we will consider how leased areas and turbines can be sited to minimize impacts. Next slide, please. We anticipate that offshore wind leasing and development will also impact tribal cultural resources, and we will be engaging in formal tribal consultation to focus our analysis through identifying cultural resources and uses of the coast, understanding impacts to those resources and uses, and understanding how to avoid or minimize impacts through siting. Overall, our tribal and cultural resources analysis will really be driven by that consultation process. Next slide, please. So finally, both commercial and recreational fishing are expected to be impacted by offshore wind development. In the federal consistency analysis, we plan to identify impacts by fishery to the extent feasible, rather than looking at fisheries aggregated together. And we're going to be considering both exclusion from the areas within the turbines, as well as potentially longer transit times to and from fishing grounds. We'll also be discussing high-level indirect impacts to the broader seafood industry, such as wholesalers and processors. Part of this analysis will also include a consideration of the cumulative impacts of ocean species conflicts on fisheries. This includes both offshore wind build-out and other uses such as aquaculture. One final thing I'd like to mention is that at this stage, we will be performing an initial broader or programmatic impacts analysis to fisheries, and then we'll be developing a process to inform future consistency analysis and mitigation when we actually have turbines going in the water. We intend to inform our analysis and mitigation strategy through conducting outreach and engagement with the fishing community. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Coussart, who will go into more detail on our outreach and engagement plans.
Thank you, Holly. Next slide, please. So building off of Holly's last slide, I wanted to highlight that coalition of state agencies that we've mentioned a couple times today. And that coalition has been collaborating to help us orchestrate additional studies that are informing our CD analysis, conduct outreach, and help to clearly define our state's energy goals. This collaboration has helped to unify the state's review, collect data from a lot of different sources, and we're very glad to have representatives from the Energy Commission, State Lands Commission, Utilities Commission, Fish and Wildlife, and Ocean Protection Council with us on the call today. Next slide, please. The coalition's focus, therefore much of the analysis that we'll be doing, is complemented by outreach and engagement, which has been going on for about the past 5 years. So along with our state and federal partners, we consider this to be one of the most critical elements of our process. And as part of this process, we do outreach to several different components of the community. First is tribal outreach. On the North and Central Coast, we do our outreach with state and federally recognized tribes. Dr. Huckabridge, our Coastal Commission Tribal Liaison, has received several consultation requests from tribes on the North Coast thus far that she will be managing in the coming months. And we also plan to conduct outreach and consultations with tribes on the Central Coast as that process continues to unfold. Regarding fishing activities, we are participating in statewide fisheries engagement with commercial, charter, and recreational fishermen. And in this respect, we are collaborating with our state and federal partners to do CD-specific outreach again in the coming months before we have our first hearing. With respect to local communities, we consider those to be anyone that may be impacted both positively or negatively, members of the public, groups that were not previously identified, such as ENGOs. We encourage that outreach to happen, and we continue to conduct that again as this process goes on. And finally, we conduct a lot of our general public outreach through a variety of different formats, and that's webinars such as this one, informational hearings. We conduct previously in-person meetings, phone calls, emails, and informal webinars. All of these can be formal or informal in nature. We encourage members of the public to reach out to us or to our partner agencies as they are able. Next slide, please. And so as previously mentioned, I wanted to highlight some of the examples of studies that the State Coalition has helped to produce and some that are in the process of being developed. These studies can be broadly categorized into a couple different areas. First is environmental studies, which are listed, and those do include fishing, data integration, technology studies, and a few others. Next slide. They've been designed by the State Coalition to complement BOEM studies and to fill the knowledge gaps that are helping to inform our consistency analysis. While the studies to date have been mostly focused on the North Coast, since it's the first area under review, we anticipate that many more will come about as we continue to work on offshore wind development, and the State Coalition that we work with to help develop those studies will continue to evolve and support those needs. And you'll notice the little asterisk that indicates future studies that are still in the process of being developed. Next slide. At this time, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Huckabridge for her closing remarks.
Thanks, Amanda. And thanks to Holly. I also would like to again thank Commissioner Douglas and Ms. Thurston Keller for their remarks today. And I'd like to give a special shout out to our state agency staff partners, many of whom are on the Zoom today. Preparing for these CDs is a heavy lift, and I'm grateful for all the support from our state coalition, especially from our sister resource agencies, the Energy Commission, Ocean Protection Council, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and State Lands Commission. And with that, that concludes our presentation, and I will turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much.